December 2007, I experienced a trip that was one of the best and worst times of my entire life. It was the best because of the things that you think of when you think of stereotypical Africa. The people and their strong culture displayed in music, dance, dress, art, language, and loving hospitality. The rugged beauty of the mountains. The hustle and bustle of Nairobi, a city so westernized yet so full of political problems and poverty. And the wildlife we experienced on our first safari, and also in the African bush that was our own backyard. Welcome to Songor, Kenya, a village so small it only consisted of one tiny street, a police station, and a shopping center. Although not a shopping center like you would think of living in the US, we were able to buy food and phone cards here, two major necessities. This was our home for the several months that we lived in Songor. We lived with a pastor and his family on what was called a compound. In our case, it was a gated yard filled with 5 small homes for 4 families. We had to learn to live without running water or electricity. This made even routine things such as showers, laundry, or dishes a challenge. The dishes were made even more challenging by the constant appearance of farm animals. The chickens fought for the scraps as you washed, and the cows almost always knocked the clean dishes off the table while they were drying. And then there was the latrine, our bathroom. On the outskirts of town, just a mile or so from our home, was a river. It was used by the locals for bathing, laundry, watering cattle, and drinking water. Yes, drinking water. Every morning a trip was made to the river to gather the water needed for the day. Like everything else, water was carried home by hand, balanced on top of women's heads or on the backs of mules. Although it took a lot of work for even the smallest tasks, the simplicity and the slow pace of life were a breath of fresh air. People were valued as most important, and any task was put aside to help someone in need or just to talk. The children were enthralled by the Wazungu, or white people, and I was just as entertained by them. When I came home, I left part of my heart in Kenya. On December 26, 2007, Kenya held its presidential elections. Unlike in the United States where you have the freedom to choose a candidate, in Kenya you vote along tribal lines. When President Moi Kibaki was accused of rigging and stealing the election from opponent Raila Odinga, the country fell into turmoil. With shouts of "Pamoja tusonge mbele," together let's move forward, and Chungwa, or orange, Raila and his party, the Orange Democratic Movement, called for widespread protests. Rioters filled the streets, setting up roadblocks of boulders and burning tires. Kenyan police fought to stop the protesters with tear gas, water cannons, and even live ammunition. The slums of Nairobi and the city of Kisumu became hotbeds of violence. Several politicians and members of parliament were assassinated. Tribes turned on each other and began warring, sparking ethnic cleansing. Some reported that upwards of 600,000 people were forced to flee their homes with only the clothes on their backs. The displaced traveled in trucks and buses, overflowing with supplies and people. People were burned, shot with bullets and poisonous arrows, and hacked to death with pongas and machetes. Formerly seen as one of the most democratic of African nations, the post-election violence in Kenya left the world watching in shock. At first, the violence was about an hour away from Songor in the city of Kisumu, but the hostility traveled closer to our town of Songor as refugees flooded into the local police station. With the help of our host, Pastor Clyde Agola, we were able to purchase the village's remaining maize or corn flour and water treatment supplies to donate to the refugees. Upon arriving at the police station, we were shocked to see over 1,500 refugees with no food or shelter and little clothing. Because of the lack of any type of bathroom or access to clean drinking water, the police and officials were fearful of the spread of malaria, cholera, and other diseases. The children flocked to see the strange white visitors, while the adults watched us with sad eyes. They came to us and begged us to call home and ask for help from our country. By the end of January 2008, the situation was worsening and much more widespread. The mission agency, Eastern Mennonite Missions, decided to move our team out of the country and back to the United States. It was hard to leave without saying goodbye to our family back in Songor, and even harder to leave knowing that we were leaving them and the people of Kenya behind to face the situation alone. As Lisa McKay said in her book, My Hands Came Away Red, just because blood and smoke are not a reality for me tonight doesn't mean they're not for someone else. They are still out there, adrift in the sea of violence that we left behind. But no longer would we spend nights of fitful sleep hearing the loud noises outside. No longer would we watch the broadcasts containing live images of people protesting or being killed by police or members of other tribes. These months were some of the worst of my life. Some may wonder why, after something like this, I still have a love for the country of Kenya. But the people of Kenya touched my heart in a way I can't explain, and I'll remember their faces for the rest of my life.